I'm doing that thing where I give everybody else the credit or discredit depending on how you view it. But I want to acknowledge that Ferenc did the bulk of the work and is responsible for motivating all the ideas in this talk. So he deserves all the credit. So we're studying social groups, and many animals live socially. And with social living, there often come inherent costs. Okay, I'm talking about these broadly, so they can be anything from competition to other more specific things. But in this talk, I'm just going to talk about them generally. So with the potential conflict and competition of living with other individuals, this is generally thought to have costs. And in a system that has conflict or tension and costs, then we would expect the systems to move towards resolution. So if there's tension, then it would tend to want to be resolved or balanced. Classically, in a lot of animal social groups, people have looked at dominance hierarchies established through aggressive interactions or other competitive interactions. Other people have talked about it and will talk about more about these kinds of structure, but they allow for some stability that allows individuals to potentially reduce costs of conflict in groups. These are typically established through aggressive interactions. But we know that social living, sociality and social structure is made up of many types of interactions. So I forgot I was using this. But as one of the themes of yesterday's discussion groups was, there are more than one type of interaction that any individual is going to experience. And so a basic question is how to actually go about extracting longer-term social relationships and higher-order social structure from individual interactions and different types of interactions. And classically, a lot of these questions about social structure and multiple types of relationships maybe have been thought about more in what might be thought of more socially complex species. But I think what's interesting here is that since social living inherently comes with some costs, we can think about how structure emerges from interactions regardless of social complexity of the species. So I'm going to talk, what we're going to focus on today is, as a focal system, is the yellow-bellied marmot, which is this large sciurid rodent and found throughout much of the western United States and up into Canada at high elevations, usually in mountainous areas. And the study population that we're going to focus on today has been under long-term study at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab in Colorado. So for several decades now, basic parameters or basic measures about their population sizes and demography have been measured. And just to give you guys a really quick sense of the kinds of data that have been collected, animals are live trapped, and kind of a whole slew of information on them is collected. And importantly for what we're talking about today is that they're individually tagged, and so they're individually identifiable. And we collect we do observations of their social interactions. We watch them remotely, and then we can identify which individuals are interacting with whom. And actually, so since about 2003, we've been collecting a little bit more detailed social interaction data. And just for talking generally about the types of interactions today, we focus on two broad categories of interactions, sort of these positive, cohesive interactions, which are things like greeting or grooming each other, or sitting in proximity with each other, and more negative interactions, which are things like competitive interactions, aggression, over-aggression, or displacement. So from these interactions, from 2003 to 2012. Oh, and I should say that we have multiple colonies that we follow regularly. And for today's talk, we're just focusing on two of them. And all of the colonies are kind of found along this north-south gradient in this valley, this kind of river valley area. And so we're focusing on picnic and river for today's talk. And just to note that picnic is found up valley, so at further north and at a higher latitude, so they experience some different ecological factors. Really quick introduction to marmot sociality that's relevant for the talk today. These guys provided sort of a system of what I was saying before, where they experience extreme ecological constraints, which shape their social system. So this is picnic in the spring when they emerge. And so they're coming out often into like 2 meters of snow, something like that. So overwinter survival is very important to them. They have a short window of time to do everything. These are some of the fox kits that are always there every year down in river, for example. So they experience a lot of predation risk as well during the summer. So they have limited suitable habitat type. And actually, a lot of studies have shown that these guys are kind of forced to be social. They're forced to live socially because of these constraints. A little bit of biology. They're considered adults at 2 years old when they can reproduce. And as yearlings or 1-year-olds, almost all the males disperse and about half of the females disperse. So what you end up with are these related groups of females in colonies. And what it also has been found that females seem to have a reproductive strategy where it's been called daughter recruitment. So they try to recruit daughters. They can increase their own fitness by potentially recruiting daughters to settle. But there's also evidence for reproductive suppression of younger females, including of daughters by mothers, so that individuals will try to enhance their own fitness direct fitness over that of daughters. So really quickly, because I want to get to Ferencz's portion, which is the interesting part, we've looked at a little bit about the structure of social interactions in the system already from a few different ways, and even from a social network standpoint, but we've focused mostly so far on individuals and dyads. So we know that age and sex, individuals of different age and sex have different typical social interaction structures, and that social interactions can influence dispersal decisions and are correlated to differences in reproductive outcomes. We also know at the dyadic level that at age and relatedness and also spatial proximity do shape tendencies to interact with each other. But what we actually haven't done too much of is looking at the group level, and I think initially there was a thought these guys aren't cooperative, maybe there isn't a group functioning. But as I said earlier, they live in these social groups and so experience this inherent social conflict. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ferenc now to actually go ahead and talk about a group level.
So you hear me? Yes, more or less. So we've been speculating about the how to understand these many negative links in these networks and how to understand the group dynamics, the group organization of these Marmot groups based on these, how to better imagine the role of these negative and positive links together, what happens there. And we decided to go back to an old theory of Harari on structural balance, Frank Harari. And maybe not all of you know this. It means that if you have a large network, a large signed graph where every single edge is either positive or negative, you can look at the loops in the network. Now we have been looking only at 3 loops, like ABCA. And the sign of the loop is the product of the signs of the edges in every loop. So if you have 3 positive, or if you have 1 positive, 3 positive, or you have 1 positive, 2 negative edges, then you have positive loops. And if you have 1 negative, 2 positive, or 3 negative edges, you have negative loops. And as Harari said in the late 50s, if you look at these loops, you can believe that if there's a negative loop, it always generates some kind of tension. So if there is tension, there is some change in the network. And according to the vision of Harari, if there is a system in development, in evolution, in continuous change, finally the number of negative loops will be decreased, and finally negative loops disappear from the system. So for example, if that's me, and I have 2 friends, and they don't like each other, we cannot go to cinema together because they don't come with me, both of them. But there are 2 solutions for this. Either they become friends and we have a positive loop and we go to cinema, 3 of us, or I will lose one of my friends and they go to cinema without me. That's not bad, I don't care, but they can go to hell without me. So actually there are 2 ways how to reduce the tension in the system. And if you do this in an iterative way, finally you lose all of the negative loops in the system. So according to Harari, but he was a mathematician, according to Harari, finally you don't have any negative loop in a network that is developing in a good direction according to Harari. And actually, he published it in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and he used it, for example, for international relation networks, the interactions between countries, and he provided very interesting narratives for the international political situation in the 50s and 56 in particular, with Soviet Union and many other countries, Egypt, so on and so forth. And actually, this theory is very elegant, it's very simple, it's very interesting, but it's not been tested many times on real data. Sometimes it has been tested on human social networks, not really on animal social networks, to my knowledge. So we decided to look at these property of the Marmot groups. What about the loop sign in these Marmot groups in time? How does it change in time? One example is the Picnic 2007 network. There's a positive network of the group. Red females and blue males. Large is large is older, the large node is older, the little one is younger. What you see in the friendship network, in the network with the positive links, is something like 2 big cliques and many other nodes. And if you look at the negative links, what you see is that many negative links are between the cliques. That's nothing like a general pattern, but actually you see it in many cases. You can see it in many kinds of networks. Then to form negative links, that's a very natural way to form negative links if you have cliques and the members of the cliques hate each other, as far as marmots can hate each other. I don't know. They can, I don't know. So if you look at this time series, that's not marmots, that's the classroom in Budapest, Hungary. And I was sampling this classroom for 4 years. And this is the sign network of the classroom over 4 years. What you see is that the blue is the positive, red is the negative. And you have a time series, and you have in time the ratio of the negative loops in the system. And what you see is that initially and at the end, Harari would be very happy to see this graph because that's supporting his theory. Here something happens in the system which is just against his vision from the late 50s. And what happened here, actually you don't have to be afraid if you don't see the pattern what you expect. You have to understand it. How to understand it? If you look at this guy, and this guy, and this guy, that's the same. Very simply, he was a very stupid guy in the classroom, and finally he was fired from the school. So he just created a very stupid network structure for the network, for the classroom, and when he was fired, the classroom, that's my interpretation. After he was fired, the classroom started to develop in the right way, according to Harari. Again, like before, but here, that was the period in the life of the classroom when this stupid guy created many problems, and he just didn't acknowledge Harari's vision from the late 50s. Actually, if you look at the trajectories of many classroom networks, I have 8. So I have 8 classrooms in 4 years. If you look at these classrooms, you can, again, that's not a statistically robust result, that's kind of finding. You can see 2 kinds of trajectories for the classrooms. On the left, what you see is what you have seen before for the marmots, is that the positive network is cliquish. You have friendship cliques. And the negative links are between the cliques, like these guys and these are kids, so they can hate each other. So these kids here and these kids here hate each other. On the right, what you see is that the positive network in blue is a bit more homogeneous. You don't see clear cliques in it. And then the negative links tend to focus on 1 or maybe 2. I call them the black sheeps in the classroom. So the stupid guys always do something bad. And so we have 2 black sheeps in the network. And if the friendship network is very homogeneous, then there's a self-organization of the emergence of stupid guys in the classroom. So they are in the target, and nobody likes them. So back to marmots. How does it look like for marmots? Because based on the classrooms, if you want, you like what Harari said. If you want, you dislike what he said. Anyway, the most important thing is to think about it. What about marmots? That's a marmot, and that's a time series of the Picnic group, as far as I remember. So there's the Picnic time series. And this inset only wants to show you that we also did some individual-based stochastic simulations for the marmot groups. We don't have anything like a result, not even findings, but we are fighting very hard. Maybe in 10 years we can have some results, because it's really hard. We have many parameters, and it's just, I don't say hopeless, but it is. So if you look at many properties of the networks of the previous slide, for the Picnic and the river groups, there's just the time series of the ratio of negative links in time, the ratio of negative loops, and the ratio of negative loops and negative links in time. So what do they mean? First of all, what you see is that year 2012, the last one, is a strange year. So nobody knows what, we don't really know, so Tina doesn't know what happened there. So 2012, something happened in the system. It's always a very stupid value, so here, so here. But if you forget the last year, yes? Sorry? Yes, exactly, I'm sorry. So time is years, 10 years. So if you forget the last year, you don't have to, but if you forget the last year, you may have, you don't have to, but you may see some kind of tendencies on the graphs. I don't want to convince you, especially not because it's only 2 groups, and we are still analyzing the 6 other groups. So if we have 8 groups, we are happy to do some meaningful statistical analysis. Now it's just something what we have found for picnic and river. But actually, these are the 2 best described groups as far as I remember. So that's high quality data in Marmot terms. What is interesting is the last 2 plots, in my opinion. That wants to mean that, so the key message of Harari is that you can, if you want to have a stable group, you can have negative links, it's no problem. But the negative links should form positive loops. So the problem is not negative links, the problem is negative loops in the system. So it's an issue how many negative loops you have compared to how many negative links you have. And if the group is performing well, if it's an intelligent, good Marmot group, then we can say that even with a large amount of negative links, they are able to form negative loops. Of course, the mechanistic details is behavior, and animal behaviors is not easy. But we have to speculate about them, especially because we see these graphs. So it's an issue, how can they be able to build more or less negative loops with a given amount of negative links in the system. On the next slide, you don't see anything in time. You see the ratio of negative loops against the female-male ratio and the ratio of adults in the system. And that's a bit more biological, so that's something to understand. Again, you don't have to, intentionally, we didn't want to have anything like a trend line. You look at it and you like it or dislike it. Something like a weak finding, that's what we want to see, is that maybe females and young individuals destabilize the group in a sense. So the old ones and the males are better for group stability. And the combination of young females is very dangerous, you know it. So do we have any conclusion? That's your part.
All right. So actually thinking about what Ferenc was saying, we had sort of, as a starting hypothesis, thought about the ways that the different demographic groups, adults and yearlings and males and females, might influence the group. So you could speculate that adults might stabilize or destabilize the groups in a way. But I think what's interesting in this case, even though they're preliminary results and hopefully are to generate discussion at a workshop like this, so I think they'll illustrate some of the things that have come up at this workshop, and I think other people are going to talk about, for example, demographic patterns and population fluctuations. So actually, Ferenc was mentioning that 2012 looked like a very weird year in terms of a lot of the loops. And as he was saying, we're not trying to extrapolate at the moment, but this is a direction we're interested in looking in. As there were in the years that we just presented major population fluctuations. So this is something we're interested in looking at. And certainly in the last few years, there was a population crash in picnic, especially. And then in river, it looks like there was also a population crash or two that maybe was not the exact same times as picnic. But I think what's interesting about this kind of theory or hypothesis is not that we expect all groups or systems to start to look the same, but actually to be able to give us a common vocabulary or to look for patterns in different groups, and begin to think about why some systems may show a certain type of structural stability or structural balance or not. And just a quick thing, what we were talking about with the demographic groups. I think we're also very interested in looking at adult females in the system, which have been a focus of a lot of study, because they're the most stable age, sex group in the system. They're the ones who settle in a group as an adult and will continue to experience the same group members over a course of multiple years. But with yearlings, they actually are involved in more affiliative interactions, but they're also the ones who are going to be leaving the system potentially and could potentially introduce more instability. So what Ferenc was saying, I think it's a nice distinction between the presence of negative or affiliative links versus the structuring of the loops. Some interesting things to consider are that group size, kind of related to what I was saying about adult females being the most stable group. Group size and adult female ratio are negatively correlated in years. If that makes sense. So in years that the population crashes, the groups crash, more of the groups are composed of adult females. And then so just starting to think about how adult females as a group might influence these. Is one direction that we're really interested in looking at. And right now, what we're seeing is that there's not an obvious pattern that jumps out, and that there's actually quite a bit of variation between colonies and also within the same colony across different years. So just as a general discussion point, I think it's useful to incorporate an idea of multiple relationships into the study of social conflict and any tendencies towards structural balance. And I think it might be interesting to discuss with other people who are looking at triadic structures defined in other ways, or structural balance or social conflict defined in other ways. And it might be an interesting comparative point to think about what makes sense, what makes the most sense for any system. Again, social conflict and competition should be inherent in any social system without a need for social complexity per se. And as I said before, I think one of the exciting things about these kinds of theories, is the ability to generate potentially testable hypotheses that allow you to ask new questions about a given system, but also start to facilitate comparisons between groups and systems. And that's been a recurring theme, I think, at this workshop so far. And with that, we were going to keep that pretty short, and just wanted definitely to acknowledge Dan Blumstein, who's the main PI on the Marmot studies, and the entire Marmot crew, and just some funding sources that have been critical for the data collection. And then with that, thank all of you guys, and I think we will jointly take questions as well. So.